So a quick reminder that we have our interpreting in 6 languages. We will be making use of that in this panel. The next panel, consisting of 3 members, Mrs. Hohlmeier, I'm sure, will arrive any minute. First of all, on my right, Mrs. Vicky Ford from the UK, who is a member of the Conservative and Reformist group in this Parliament. She's been a member of the European Parliament since 2009, and she is chair of the Internal Market and Consumer Protection Committee. And in addition, of particular interest to us this morning, she is the rapporteur on the Firearms Directive, which is set to introduce tighter rules on gun ownership. Here, unlike the previous legislation that we looked at in the first panel, where the legislation is almost completed, here we're just at the beginning. The Commission just presented its draft law on the subject of firearms control in December, just over a month ago. So we're right at the start of the legislative process on this. On my left, Mr. Agustín Díaz de Mera from Spain, who is a member of the EPP group in this Parliament, the European People's Party, a member of the Civil Liberties Committee, and also, in fact, a former Director General of Police in Spain, which I imagine has been particularly helpful to his work as rapporteur on the Europol regulation. Now, the purpose of the Europol regulation is to beef up or enhance Europol's mandate. And I'm sure our listeners will be interested to hear how this will help in the fight against terrorism. Here, things are well advanced. A Parliament and Council agreement was reached in November 2015, and the full Parliament is expected to vote on this in the spring. Yesterday, of course, we had the Director of Europol in our seminar, and so Mr. Díaz de Mera may wish not only to tell us about the legislation and Parliament's role in scrutinising this regulation, but also comment on what Mr. Wainwright said. But first of all, we'll start, if we may, with Mrs. Ford to speak about the Firearms Directive. Mrs. Ford has to leave us early to go to another meeting, so after a brief introduction from her, we'll see if we move straight on to questions, or perhaps ask Mr. Agustín to speak.
Thank you very much. This is my 3rd meeting today on the Firearms Directive, which maybe gives you an idea of the sort of seriousness which the Parliament's taking. I started this morning very early with a shadows meeting, a second shadows meeting, and then I've just had an exchange of views with some stakeholders put together through my group members, from stakeholders from all over Europe, discussing certain elements of it. But by way of background, we've obviously had European rules on firearms since 1991, so for 25 years we've had European rules on firearms. They were last reviewed in 2008, and in the light of the Paris attacks and other incidents, it's absolutely right that we look again at those pieces of legislation and see if there are any loopholes that need to be closed, or any other ways that we need to address the law. So, for example, the current exemption for what is called in some countries blank firers, weapons that were only meant to be ever capable of firing blanks, which were exempt from legislation, were allowed to be traded without anybody having to have a firearms certificate. That needs to be reconsidered in the light of what happens. So rules on blank firers and what is in some countries they are called acoustic weapons. That will be one of the issues that we will need to look at and is part of the Commission's proposal. However, there are a lot of concerns about the drafting of the Commission's proposal, and when the Commission came to present its proposal to the committee that I chair just before Christmas, even they admitted that their drafting was far from perfect. And the concerns are coming from museums and collectors, from people who are involved in military reenactments, from people involved in sporting and hunting communities, from filmmakers, from some countries, how they impact their military reservists. So there are a number of different issues within the text that we need to address. And because of the number of different issues within the text, that's why I, as committee chair, volunteered to take on also the role of rapporteur to try and see how we can clarify this as quickly as possible, but also get the detail right. We have agreed an initial timescale for the proposal to go through the scrutiny and amendment process. That will involve a hearing in mid-March, a first draft of my report towards the end of March, and a vote currently timetabled for June. If it needs to take longer, it will take longer to get it right, but I hope that will be workable, and it's a similar timescale to the one that is being worked on by the different member states. So one of my messages to the public at large is we are taking time to try to get this right. That is why I'm trying to meet as many different stakeholders through their organisations as possible. We had one stakeholder meeting with my group this morning. I'm going to have another one in London tomorrow. I'm hoping to have one with all the shadows at the end of this month. We may also be, for example, visiting a military museum to understand more about how museums look after their collections. So we are looking at the different people who have been concerned that there are unintended consequences of the Commission's drafting, and I may table a number of different suggestions for how we could deal with each of those issues in order that they're put to a vote. I'm working very closely with my shadows from the other political groups. They've worked on identifying the list of issues which we've discussed this morning. We're also talking very closely to a number of member states to understand how they share best practice as well. So key things that we want to get from this are to tighten up any loopholes. As I said, the acoustic or blank firers is one area which has been pointed as an issue that urgently needs addressing. The better sharing of registers, for example, we need to look at as well to make sure that the single market works as well as possible in this area. This is obviously an area where it's a minimum harmonisation legislation, so member states that wish to have stronger controls can obviously continue to do so. There's no suggestion that this would necessarily be one-size-fits-all sets of rules, because there are differences as well in certain member states. But the idea is to make sure that at European level we have addressed any of these loopholes as clearly as possible, but during the scrutiny and amendment process we intend to make sure that some of these concerns who are coming from other stakeholders can also be better addressed, and that the language doesn't have some of these unintended consequences. Would you like an example of an unintended consequence? So an example is, for example, the Commission's current text says that a museum would not be able to add anything new to their collection. And clearly, museums do add new items to their collection, and it's not the intention, I believe, or the wish of the public to effectively freeze all of our museums in history. So that's the sort of amendment that I think the Commission's text is not perfect, and we will need to change during the amendment process.
Thank you, Mrs. Ford. We welcome the third member of this panel, Mrs. Monika Hohlmeier from Germany, a member of the EPP group. Mrs. Holmeyer will come back to you, and we'll come over to Mr. Diaz-Primera in a little while as well. But I think, given Mrs. Ford's time constraints, it would be a good thing if we move straight on to see if there are a couple of questions on her topic. So any questions on the Firearms Directive and on what Mrs. Ford has just told us?
Yeah. I'm Marc Vidal. I'm from a Catalan newspaper, Ara. My question is, well, I can imagine, I assume that this is not a problem of a military museum, but a black market on, because the Kalashnikov used in the Paris attacks, for example, I can assume it was getting in a black market. So what are the provisions on that issue, and what is your expectations on this?
Dirts Vikmanis, Latvijas avīze, Latvijā. I have a question regarding the reality about this legislation. You're saying there are loopholes, but as my colleague mentioned, there was used weapon which was bought in black market. How you can tackle with the black market? That's the core question. I don't think that terrorists are buying their firearms in the shops. Yes, thank you very much.
So there's two separate streams of work. I mean, clearly they're looking at what are the legal ways in which you can own a weapon is a separate stream of work, and tightening up the policing and prevention of illicit trade is also a vital piece of work. And that piece of work is going through this Parliament, through the Libe Committee, and not through the internal market, which is looking at the legal trade. However, even within the legal legislation, we need to look at whether there were any loopholes. So currently, there is no legal restriction on a weapon that was a live firer and then was converted into a blank firer. And what has been discovered, unfortunately, is that some of those blank firing conversions were easily reversed, moderately easily reversed, and therefore it wasn't an illegal trade because these had been specifically exempted. Making sure that that loophole is closed should help the authorities then to be able to focus their actions on the illicit trade. And that is why we're working very closely. And even within this piece of legislation, there's roles for the Civil Liberties Committees on penalties and data protection issues and areas that their expertise. My expertise is, in my committee, should be looking at what is the legal area. Okay? And that is why we're also ensuring that as far as possible we can listen to the stakeholders who are legally using firearms and making sure their issues are addressed. Thank you.
I'm Gemma Saura from La Vanguardia newspaper in Barcelona. I was wondering, these blank arms that you're suggesting, is because you have any evidence that it was ever used by terrorists, or it's just a precaution?
Giulio Magnani, per Armi e Tiro, Italia. Vorrei parlare in italiano per cortesia. Grazie, thank you. Riferendomi alla previsione di divieto totale delle armi di categoria.
You are talking about completely banning B7 category weapons. So these are weapons, civilian weapons that have absolutely nothing to do with military weapons. So I don't really see the interest of doing this. These types of weapons have never been used, only in one case, I believe, for terrorist attacks. So bearing in mind this information, we heard yesterday and today, we heard this several times, the presence of refugees, of foreign nationals, Muslims, for example. This is not a sufficiently good argument to limit migration or the practice of Islam, which is quite normal.
Now, when it comes to arms, there are opposing conclusions. Now, when you look at individual cases which have been certified, well, there's an idea of banning a whole category of weapons. Now, in this context, what does it mean? Does it mean that Europe doesn't have faith in its citizens who are already being monitored?
In answer to the first question about the blank firers and evidence, yes. It's been identified through, and you may be aware that actually there were some very detailed studies undertaken throughout 2004, as far back as 2014, even by the Commission. There have been detailed studies of this issue. So, yes. And there's been press on it as well, yes. And in answer to the question of adding to the list of prohibited weapons this category that is semi-automatic weapons for civilian use that resemble automatic weapons, this is the Commission's language. The Commission was challenged very heavily in committee about this language, including by myself from the chair, and even the Commission admitted that the language used was very unclear. This notion of resemble and some sort of cosmetic appearance was not at all clear. This has been identified as one of the issues that both myself and the shadows believe needs to be addressed, and I believe we will see a number of different suggestions of how we might amend that. But the suggestion of the wording from the Commission is not language that I would support. It's not language that I've heard the majority of my shadows wishing to support, and so therefore I think it is unlikely to stay in the final text when it comes through committee. But I suspect there will be a number of different suggestions of ways that we could amend this. But the idea that it's just a cosmetic difference that you're looking at is clearly something that has been addressed as an issue, and where Member States have tried to have legislation in this way in this past, it's proved legally extremely difficult and challenging. So it is something that I believe will see a lot of evolution over the next 4 or 5 months about how that is going to be defined.
Thank you, Mrs. Ford. Thank you. So we've discussed the Firearms Directive at some length. I think it's time for us to move on to the other topics.